Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with China economic analyst Dr. Antonio Graceffo. He touched on Beijing's interest in Afghanistan, how their plan of global dominance through the Belt and Road Initiative is playing out, and the economic risks of doing business with a communist regime. Let's dig in. Welcome, Antonio. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Tiffany.
So with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, some are noting major players are now trying to step in, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party. Some also note that China has a similar Belt and Road Initiative deal with Pakistan, and that could play into Afghanistan. But what's your take?
The main involvement of China with Afghanistan is to protect its investments that it has in Pakistan, because Pakistan, or CPEC, which is the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is the jewel of the Belt and Road. It's kind of the most important point of the Belt and Road because it would allow China to have direct access to the oil from the Middle East, bypassing the sea, bypassing the United States Navy. They'd be able to go overland through Pakistan. And the projects in Pakistan have been subjected to terrorist attacks repeatedly. Often these terrorist attacks are by the Pakistan Taliban or the Afghanistan Taliban, which are in Pakistan. And so one of the main issues is that Beijing wants to negotiate with the Taliban in Afghanistan to get them to agree not to attack Chinese interest in Pakistan. The other one is that they want to get an agreement from the Taliban in Afghanistan that they will not support Uyghur independence movements or terrorism in Xinjiang, inside of China.
So it sounds like this is a kind of relationship where both sides are in it for themselves. For instance, China wants assurance about security in the region, but also access to the rare earth minerals. And the Taliban wants money from China, as it's been cut off from most of its funds. So how do you see that playing out going forward?
That's the issue with things like sanctions and boycotts of countries. I just did a piece on Venezuela recently as well. I mean, it's just a really similar situation. You have these bad actors. You have Venezuela, you have North Korea, you have Afghanistan, and obviously the West brings sanctions against them, particularly the United States. And it makes sense to do that on the one hand. On the other hand, it then isolates them. And then China becomes the friend in time of need. And that's the person you remember. You remember the person who helped you when everybody else rejected you. And so China steps into a place like Afghanistan and offers them money, offers them friendship, and in this case offers them legitimacy. And in fact, in July, they held high-level talks with Taliban representatives in Beijing, which suggests to me that they will probably officially recognize the Taliban or may not officially recognize them, because in doing so, they would be legitimizing claims that the Taliban is not legitimate. So they may just conduct business as usual with them with no need to say that they're legitimate. But either way, so the Taliban needs legitimacy, they need friends, they need money, and of course Beijing is willing to provide money. Now, to protect the CPEC investments, China would do almost anything. The rare earth minerals that you mentioned are one of the most valuable resources in the region. Very important, though, for China's continued operation and for their continued success economically is energy, oil, which, of course, is the main commodity that would be passing through Pakistan on CPEC. So that's more the immediate need. A long-term investment, which, as we know, Beijing takes often very long-term planning, would be the rare earth minerals. And then you're going to trillions of dollars.
And so what are some of the ramifications of Beijing funding the Taliban?
Now you have the fall of Afghanistan, you have the Taliban. I don't know what's going to happen in terrorism. Is the fall of Afghanistan going to generate terrorism? Will there be more terrorist activities outside of? Certainly there'll be more anger channeled and directed towards China, without any doubt. Will the fall of Afghanistan cause the Taliban to then fight resistance groups that are in Afghanistan? Will they then flee to other countries? And then we may have an increase in terrorism because of that. Will these fleeing terrorists, will they then go to Xinjiang? Maybe they will be angry at anybody that's supporting the Taliban, right? So if China is funding the Taliban and the Taliban is fighting these resistance groups, will the resistance groups then go to Xinjiang and create, terrorist activity there? So there's so many negative effects going on in the world right now that I just don't see how China can continue with the BRI, how they could complete it in the way that they believe the way that they believe that they would.
Historically, Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires. So if Beijing were to pour a lot of investments into the country, what are some of the risks, or are there risks?
To be honest with you, I've seen a lot of media, particularly conservative media, that's saying now China is going to be in the same quagmire that the U.S. was in, that Britain was in, Russia was in. And I disagree. I mean, there certainly are tons of risks, and we'll talk about that. But I will say that in general, the risk to the CCP is not as great as it was to the U.S. or Russia or Britain, because China does not want to change anything about Afghanistan. China is not imposing a governmental system on Afghanistan. China will not, moving forward, will not say to Afghanistan, you must become a democracy, you must allow girls to attend school, you must stop, honor killings or wife burnings or, children, any of the things that the West would do in terms of human rights. China will turn a blind eye to all of that. China is very adept at hiding behind its policy of non-intervention in foreign countries. First of all, there's probably not going to be Chinese troops on the ground, and if there are, assuming that they do take over the U.S. bases, particularly the Air Force Base, assuming they do, it's going to be with permission of the Taliban or in cooperation with the Taliban. They will not be an occupying force in that sense. So they will probably not be suffering loss of life the way we did, which is, I hate to say it's unfortunate, but it's a bit unfortunate, but China won't be facing that risk. Now, they'll still be facing tremendous investment risk because there'll be no way to enforce any agreement that they have with the Taliban. They won't be able to enforce, other than if they were then to act as belligerent occupying military like the U.S. did or Britain did or Russia did, in which case they would step into the same quagmire that we were in. So basically, I think Beijing's agreement with the Taliban will be probably that Beijing will give them recognition, legitimacy, and money. In return, they'll promise not to attack projects in Pakistan, not to invade Xinjiang. Eventually, they will allow the mining of the rare earth minerals without loss of life, without the projects being attacked. That will be the agreement. Now, if that will be upheld or not, I don't know. Now, the Taliban could, for example, agree to that and then attack the mining projects anyway. It's possible. I'm not saying that they would, but I'm saying it's possible. And then the Taliban, all they'd have to do is claim that it's a splinter group, it's some other organization, it's a pro-U.S., a democracy movement, something like this. They could blame it on anyone.
So speaking of rare earth minerals, it sounds like if Beijing were to go after these in Afghanistan, it would be a multi-step process. What's your take on that?
I think the rare earth minerals will actually be the final step. I think that they have a few projects that they either started or they had contracts for. I think that those will happen first. And if I look at Burma as my blueprint for Afghanistan, in Burma you have territories that are held by the various ethnic resistance armies. Theoretically, the Tatmadaw holds control over the whole country, but the ethnic armies control their areas to some extent. And one of the things that they do is that they attack pipelines that are going to China. So the federal government then pays taxes to the rebels to protect the pipelines. And I could see a situation like this arising in Afghanistan. So I think that China going after the rare earth minerals is probably several steps away. I think the first step is going to be to secure these agreements with Afghanistan. I think we may even see Chinese troops taking over the U.S. bases, assuming the Taliban allows that, assuming that China wants to do that. I think that would happen first, and maybe that'll be kind of a feeling out process to see if these projects get attacked, if the terrorism actually does stop. then they could go after the rare earth minerals, because apparently it's very, very, very expensive to run these rare earth mineral projects. So that would take a huge investment. And at that point, they'd kind of be vulnerable. They'd sort of be on the hook in a way, because once you've sunk that much money in, if the project was threatened, you'd almost have to pay any sort of ransom to move forward on that project, because you wouldn't want to lose the money that you've already invested.
And it sounds like if that were to succeed, Beijing would need stability in the region. And experts are noting there's a civil war happening in Afghanistan right now. There's the Taliban, there's the remaining forces of the Afghan government, Al-Qaeda starting to pop up, other mentions of other factions. So how do you see this playing out going forward?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I don't trust a lot of what I'm reading in the liberal press. I read this morning in one of the major newspapers that the Taliban has now conquered the last, holdout area of resistance. And I thought, it's not even remotely possible. I don't even believe that the Taliban can hold a unified Afghanistan. No one in history has ever been able to hold a unified Afghanistan. There's too many tribes, too many ethnic minorities, too many conflicting interests. And I just don't believe it. I believe that they will have an ongoing, it'll be very much like Burma, they will just have an ongoing civil war, probably forever. And yeah, I believe probably the Taliban will be able to hold much more of the country in a unified manner and in a relatively stable manner, more than the US or Russia or Britain ever was able to do, albeit with dramatically reduced human rights and freedoms and quality of life for citizens. But as far as stability goes, I believe that we're going to see just a perpetual civil war, because not everyone in Afghanistan wants to be ruled by the Taliban. To even believe that for a minute is to negate all of the differences of the various tribes, the ethnicities, the various sects of Islam. I mean, it to me, that's almost as racist. That's like saying everyone from Afghanistan is the same, or all Muslims are the same, and it's absolutely not the case. I'm talking to the Hazara right now, and they absolutely don't want to be ruled by the Taliban. They don't have as many guns, they don't have the numbers, but yeah, they want to fight, and there's many other groups that will continue to fight.
Some have called China's Belt and Road Initiative China's plan for world domination. How successful do you think the Chinese Communist Party has been?
I believe from the beginning of the Belt and Road, I would say the first year or two, I was terrified that this was the spearhead of Beijing basically dominating the earth. They were going to get all these countries into debt slavery to Beijing. They were going to get all these countries to vote along with Beijing in the UN and other world bodies. They were going to pass through all sorts of nonsense rules and agreements, or they were going to block, for example, interventions in genocides. 2013 through about 2015, it really looked like everything Beijing was doing was suddenly winning. It was almost like they had worked years on this plan before they released it. Almost a Japanese model in a way, that you don't release the plan until it's absolutely perfect and it's just ready to go. And that's what it looked like. And it looked like it was just going to be this juggernaut, sweeping the globe. But then Donald Trump came into office in the United States, and of course there was major pushback from the United States, and there were trade tariffs against China, and there were cries for human rights all over Europe. And when Trump came into power, suddenly there was a lot of pushback from Europe. Sweden stood up to China on numerous occasions. The Nobel Prize, the awarding of the Nobel Prize. There were just so many examples. And then the pandemic came, and then at first it looked again like, man, Beijing did a glove save. They started telling the world that they saved us from this pandemic that they started. Between the U.S. boycott, the U.S. Tariffs, pushback in Europe, human rights, all these things, and then a general economic downturn, suddenly made the completion of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, much less likely. And you figure that CPEC, Pakistan, that is the jewel of the BRI. I mean, that is the showcase. This is the greatest project they have, is the Pakistan project. Well, to date, it's only 1/3 completed,
And the Belt and Road Initiative has also been called China's debt trap diplomacy. So for the countries who sign up for the initiative, how are they faring?
All the promises that they made to Pakistan, because the basic contract here is we're going to loan you money at interest. You're going to hire our engineers to build the projects that we suggest to you. You then owe us money for that, but it's okay because these projects are going to increase your GDP by X, Y, and Z amount. And it far exceeds the money you owe us. And you're going to be richer and the world's going to have prosperity and we're all going to be wonderful and Xi Jinping is the greatest thing that's ever happened. There's not one example of that anywhere in the world. Nowhere in the world is there a country going, well, now we're all rich because we signed up to, this BRI. Now our GDP is so huge and all our citizens are better off and we don't mind the money we're paying in Beijing because it's a pittance. That hasn't happened. Hasn't even happened in Pakistan. When the very first BRI debt payments came due, already Pakistan couldn't afford to pay them. Already had to go to Beijing and borrow additional money from Beijing to pay the debt service on the BRI loans that they own to Beijing. Okay, please explain to me how this is helping Pakistan. Please explain to me how this is going to convince other countries to go, oh, this is great. We want some of that. We want in on that. So if they can't complete the Pakistan project, how are they going to complete anything else on the BRI? We're 7 years in, and they are 1/3 of the way done in Pakistan. And Pakistan has not benefited from this. Chinese artisans have put Pakistani artisans out of business in whole sectors. There's entire sectors where there are no new apprentices entering, apprenticeship for certain types of trades because they're already displaced by the Chinese. So on the one hand, it's very worrying. On the other hand, it does look like these projects are just failing for any number of reasons. The pandemic year has destroyed the local economies in these countries to such a point that any money that the governments have, they're using it to stimulate the economy, to basically to rescue their economy. They're not thinking in terms of, well, let's make a long-term investment in the BRI. They're thinking, how can I get food into people's bellies right now? Or, they're spending money on vaccines and test kits and things like that. And stimulus money in various forms in different countries. And that's what these governments are concentrating on. Remember, these are some of the poorest countries. These are some of the most debt-ridden countries. It's very difficult to walk into a country that's horribly in debt and has people that are unemployed and has people that are starving and say to them, listen, we want you to make this long-term investment, with Beijing and, complete this project. So it's become a non-priority for a lot of these countries.
And from an economic standpoint, what are some of the risks associated with doing business with a communist regime?
Now we had this pandemic year, which is a horrible thing. I wish it hadn't happened. However, the good thing is we have all seen with our own eyes what happens. It just takes 1 year of apprentices not entering a trade for that trade to begin to crumble. The United States right now is experiencing price inflation and shortages. And why? Because there was 1 year that the driving schools were closed and we couldn't produce new truck drivers. And that's all it took. 1 year. Amazing. Amazing. So you would think, well, wouldn't the drivers who were already employed last year be enough, or they could work overtime? No, it just doesn't work that way. I went to Bojangles Chicken, I think it was, and they were out of biscuits. I said, why don't you have biscuits? They said, oh, well, the drivers, there's not enough drivers. The biscuits are sitting in a biscuit factory, I don't know, biscuit farm, wherever they make biscuits, and they couldn't get them to the restaurant because there were no drivers. All right. So in Pakistan, you're having this happening in this whole handicraft fields where, no apprentices are entering because of the BRI, and they're just going to die out. And Pakistan will lose its capacity to do certain types of work, and Beijing's taking it over. So this is not helping the man on the street or the woman on the street. For Beijing, I just did an economic report on Beijing or on China, and originally I thought China was convincing the world to take these horribly destructive lockdown measures because they wanted to wreck everybody else's economy, and then they would be the strongest economy. And it kind of looked like that at the beginning of last year, but the Chinese economy is in shambles, and they're taking the same ridiculous lockdown strategies. They have a zero tolerance on COVID. So they're closing factories right and left. They closed a port. They're grounding aircraft. Well, if you're doing all that, how are you going to rescue the economy? And until they can rescue their domestic economy, how much money do they have to pump into the BRI? I mean, at this point, there are estimates that it might take $500 billion to complete the rest of the projects on the BRI. China doesn't have $500 billion that they can just, spend like that. So I think it's very unlikely that they're going to complete the BRI in any sense of the original vision of the BRI. I don't see them completing the BRI. Now, one clever thing that Beijing did was that they never actually published a list of these are the metrics of how you evaluate the BRI, or this is the full set of projects. There's not really a list anywhere of like the full set of projects. Basically, somebody made a joke once. They said, if you exist on the planet Earth, you're part of the BRI. And anything you succeed at doing is another success of the BRI. And that's a lot of what they're doing. I've seen articles in Chinese state media where they were claiming that a BRI project had succeeded, and it was a project that predated the BRI, or, it was before Xi Jinping was even, in power, or just some random thing that happened somewhere in the world. Like, oh, you see that? The BRI worked. So Beijing may claim victory. I don't know if they're going to claim victory. But as far as real victory, no, I don't think they're going to be able to complete this the way that they think. And then you have all these other elements.
Well, thank you so much, Antonio. Thanks for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to seeing you again.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with China economic analyst Dr. Antonio Graceffo. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.